our first budget engagement session for the fiscal year 2023. This is an opportunity for city staff to hear from you. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. During this listening session, our goal is to collect feedback from our community, and we will answer as many questions as we can live. And anything that we need to go back and research will be posted on the budget development webpage at charlottenc.gov. Following a brief presentation from our budget director, we will move into interactive polling to gain insight into what's important to you, and then we'll close out with open discussion. For polling, you will see a window pop up on the side of your screen. Select which option you'd like to vote for and click submit. When it's time for the open discussion, you can sign up using the raise your hand feature to be called upon, or sign up using the Q&A window. The raise your hand icon is on the right panel on your screen, and it looks like a high five. Staff will keep a list of who is next to speak, and when it's your turn, we will call your name and you will be unmuted. At any time, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A window. If you do not see it right now, click the three dots next to the chat button at the bottom right of your screen and select Q&A. Now we will introduce the panel that we have in the room, and we'll briefly introduce ourselves.
I'm Ryan Bergman. I'm the Strategy and Budget Director.
Brent Cagle, Assistant City Manager.
Sean Heath, City Manager's Office and Interim Director of Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Teresa Smith, CFO.
Marie Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Liz Babson, Director for the Department of Transportation.
Beverly Sanders, Charlotte Communication and Marketing.
And I'm Tiffany Blackwell with Strategy and Budget.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. If we can go ahead to the next slide. What I'm going to try to do is talk in about 10 slides about how the city's budget works. Just to give a little bit of context to how we currently fund things, and then a little bit about how decisions are made and the process for next year's budget, which starts on July 1st. So this first slide here talks about the city and the county. So we have two different governments in Mecklenburg County, City of Charlotte and then Mecklenburg County. So when you pay your tax bill, to give a little bit of context, if you have a $220,000 house, which is the current appraised median, about $1,350 of that goes to the county, or 64% of it, and about $750 of it goes to the city. So today we're specifically talking about those city funds, which again make up about 36% of your property tax bill. But just for a little more context, if you look on the right there, that shows the 5 biggest services or entities that your property tax dollars go to if you live in Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. The first is CMS support, second is CMPD, and you can read down the list there. Okay, moving on. So talking specifically about the city's budget, we have a tax rate of 34.81 cents for every $100 of assessed value. And so we split that into two buckets. The majority of it, almost 80%, will go to our general fund. And that's where we will fund operations of things, the continuous year to year, primarily salaries of all the city workers that are providing the city services. The other approximately 20% goes towards our capital program. So if you look on the pie chart to the right, you'll see the majority of the pie has the various services that we have with police and fire. I do want to call attention to transportation and housing on there, which do appear to be small, but that is only the amount of funding that we would consider operating in a given year. So there may be small programs, there may be repair, maintenance, primarily though it's the actual employee salaries. The majority of programmatic funding for transportation and housing is in the pie slice that is called out, that is separated from the rest, in capital support. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, but that's where we primarily fund some of the housing initiatives and the transportation initiatives in the city. Okay? So this is a little bit more about how the city's budget is organized. Over on the left, you see the governmental funds. So as I mentioned, These are what is primarily supported by property tax dollars, your general government services, police, fire, solid waste, and so on. And so that's how we also support our bond referendum program that we have. Over on the right there, you'll see the other city services that don't get property tax dollars. So you'll have CATS, aviation, water, and stormwater. In aviation's case, they're supported by fees at the airport of people, of airlines and businesses and people using the airport. For water and stormwater, those are supported by a dedicated bill that you pay when you use our water system. And then for CATS is a little bit different. It's kind of a hybrid approach where in Mecklenburg County, CATS does have a half-cent sales tax to support all of their operations. And then on top of that, it's, of course, user fees when people use the bus system or they use the light rail system. And then, of course, also federal funds. The other thing I'd mention on this slide, in the bottom right there, we also have a lot of various funds for very specific dedicated purposes. The best example would be grants. If we get money for a specific grant, we may have it in a special revenue fund to make sure that we only spend those funds on what we're allowed to spend them on. And then the other important example would be our hospitality funds. And so if somebody stays in a hotel room or somebody gets a meal in Charlotte and pays a meals tax, those are primarily going to our hospitality program where they can only be spent on specific things by state law. So when you hear about us as a city investing in a professional sports franchise like soccer or things like that, it's from these dedicated funding pots where the money has to be spent on something like that. You're not able to use it on general city services like police or fire. Okay? So this is another way of looking at it, but this is how I want to segue into talking about our capital program. You'll see property and sales tax, which are the biggest revenue drivers that we have in the general fund. Property tax is 55% of all of our revenue, and sales tax is 15% of all of our revenue. We split it up three different ways. The bottom two essentially support our capital program. If you see the blue arrows there and the debt service fund for CIP, that's how we support on an annual basis our capital program and our capital investments that I'll go through here in the next slide. So every 2 years in Charlotte, voters are asked to vote on a bond referendum package. And the package traditionally supports investments in transportation, in housing, and in neighborhood development. So the last time we voted on one was November of 2020, which it did pass. We had $197 million of investments that we were able to make. Those investments are ongoing, doing projects and initiatives in transportation and housing and neighborhood development. So now we're in FY2022, that's this year's budget, and as we're planning next year's budget, it will be time for another bond referendum. So this upcoming budget is very important in that we will go to the voters again in November with a proposed bond package. If it's voted, then we're able to access the funds. If it's rejected, then we're unable to. It is important to note that the ability to pay for these bond referendum is already included in the tax rate. There's nothing on the bond referendum that increases any revenue. It's just getting citizen support for our plan. So if we go to the next page. And I, of course, will not read this, but this is in the current budget, which is available on our website. This is the draft plan for the next 4 bond cycles that we came up with last year. So none of these are going to actually happen unless and until council votes on them and approves the plan the year that we actually go for the bond and the citizens approve it. So in the upcoming budget workshops, City Council will take this draft blueprint for the upcoming years, and they will suggest changes, they will adjust it. It will look different by the time we get to the voters, but it does give you an idea of some of the proposed investments that this current City Council was planning on in this past year for the upcoming bond cycles. And if we go to the next slide. So you'll see some of them here. Some of the focus that we've received from the City Council in this past budget cycle was about pedestrian safety, was about mobility beyond cars, and it was around the sidewalk program where some developments historically in Charlotte were made without sidewalks from 30, 40 years ago, and we've been slowly trying to address some of those issues. So you'll see that in the upcoming plan, there is an acceleration of funding in each of these to help support them pending City Council approval and voter approval. If we go to the next, and then a little bit about affordable housing. So this is primarily how we invest in affordable housing in Charlotte. In prior years, 2014, 2016, and before, we averaged around $15 million in our Housing Trust Fund bond. In 2018, a big initiative of the City Council at that time was to increase that, more than triple it, to $50 million. We were able to do that again in the last bond, and in the upcoming plan that again is in your budget book, there is a plan to maintain that increased higher level of funding. Okay? So maybe the key message to this slide is that everything that we do in our budget is driven one way or another by City Council, who are the elected representatives of the people. So City Council votes on priorities. From those priorities comes initiatives, and you'll see examples of some of the initiatives on the right there that do track with some of the City Council priorities. But building a budget process, building a budget, it comes from expertise from staff in certain areas around transportation and housing and things like that. But it also comes from the commentary, the initiatives that City Council is saying and supporting, and we're trying to be as reflective of their initiatives and their needs as possible. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So this is the process. So we're already past October. We had an annual strategy meeting in October of 2021. We talked about a number of things with City Council, priorities, initiatives, things of that nature. Internally, we of course have been working on this upcoming budget the whole time. February through April, we have our community engagement initiatives, including an input survey. We have these listening sessions, and we have a balancing act tool. We'll have the link at the end. We also have City Council workshops and committee meetings to work on the budget. These are, of course, public meetings if you want to tune in. Our first one, first of three, as far as budget workshops, is at 1:30 next Wednesday. And then from that, we propose a budget in early May. So that's the city manager's proposal. But that is not the budget. That has no formal authority until City Council makes adjustments, changes to it, and then City Council will vote, and then that becomes the actual budget that we begin on July 1st of the next year. Okay, so if we go to this last one, there's a couple of links on the page to our survey, to our simulation tool, and then we also have a mailbox for commentary, questions, things of that nature for citizens. Again, the way that we do all of this is any of your questions, your comments, we put into a community engagement package that we share with City Council ahead of us proposing the budget, similar to how we did it last year. So a comment on your priorities or anything, it doesn't end with us. It will be part of the package that all of City Council does get to see. So with that, I think we can stop sharing the slide and we can get to questions or comments from you guys.
While everybody's thinking about those great questions they're going to ask us, we can start off with a poll question for all of our attendees. So if we can pull up the first poll question. Bear with us just a few more moments. Okay, so of the options listed on your screen, which city department would you like to increase funding? You have options for police, housing and neighborhood services, transportation, economic development, solid waste services, and innovation and technology. So you want to take a few seconds to answer that question, and then we can share the poll results in the moment. Okay, and you can make those selections in the next 10 seconds, and then we can pull up the results. This is a slight vision test, but it looks like housing and neighborhood services, am I reading that correctly, has the highest responses? Okay. All right, thank you everyone for your participation. We have a question from one of our participants. The question is, what are the next steps for Vision Zero, and how is the High Injury Network helping to inform the work as well as any future initiatives?
Great question. This is Liz Babson, the Director for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. Obviously, you've been tracking closely our Vision Zero action plan and the work that we're doing. As you referenced the High Injury Network, that is the way in which we use a data-driven process to determine and select priorities for implementation and improvement in our transportation network. And so, back to a couple of comments that Ryan made about highlights from the 2022 bond plan, increased bond funding for Vision Zero, as well as additions that we would make and improvements to our bicycle and our pedestrian network all help to mutually support making our transportation system safer. So specific to the Vision Zero funding, we'll be putting particular focus on improving and increasing our street lighting throughout the city, because that is something that we have found based on the data is important in making that transportation system safer.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have another question from one of our attendees. The question is, the city has increased funding for affordable housing, but it isn't enough to keep up with the rising development costs and demand. Will the city consider investing more?
Sure, I can start on that one. As I mentioned, we're driven by city council priorities and how they would like to invest the resources, the limited resources that we do have. I can tell you that over the last two bond cycles, we've invested $100 million in affordable housing. And so what does that actually mean, and how does it work? Those funds are primarily used as gap funding. So it's given to a developer to allow them to keep a certain number of units below the affordability threshold for a certain period of time. So out of that $100 million over the last two bond cycles, Thus far, we've spent $87 million, and that leads to about 4,800 units. So 4,800 affordable units, that is, of course, going to make a big difference with the families that are able to use those units. And as I mentioned, we have a plan to continue the $50 million pending City Council priorities. I think that we are going through a unique economic climate, both nationally and in the region, where the region is really increasing in value. And on top of that, we do have some inflation markers that are recurring. So it is a difficult time right now. I think over the next few workshops, we'll be able to talk with City Council a little bit about their capital priorities and how they would like to see the next few years. I don't want to speak for them on what they would like to do with that. I think there are also some other housing initiatives that we have done to help. If I can turn it over to Sean for a little bit, Sean Heath, who is the interim housing director, but also manages our ARPA programs, where we've done some things to assist with housing over the last year and a half.
Thank you, Ryan. This is Sean Heath. On the Housing Trust Fund, just two additional points I would make. And one is, where possible, we also look for opportunities to identify developments in high opportunity areas. Getting the most number of affordable housing units online is of course, a consideration, but we're also interested in the quality of the affordable housing units. As Budget Director Bergman alluded to, within the Housing Trust Fund, we also have requirements associated with the AMI mix. For example, we look for proposals that have at least 20% of the units that are provided to members of the community at 30% AMI and below. And in terms of kind of the broader suite of programs that the city has put in place over the last 4 years, as Budget Director Bergman mentioned, 2018 was a pivotal year in terms of enhancing funding, doubling down on the vision in terms of the city really leaning into affordable housing, developing new policies, and leveraging city-owned land for affordable housing is another example of something that was discussed with City Council in calendar year 2021, and it's an item that we will be discussing soon with Council as we look for other opportunities to leverage not just Housing Trust Fund resources, but other assets that we have as a city in order to address the significant affordable housing challenges that we face. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, we've gotten a couple questions on public safety, so we'll go ahead and do a quick poll on public safety initiatives that are most important to you. So you can select from those three options, or crisis response units, increased police patrol of high crime areas, or neighborhood engagement activities. So you can select your initiative that's most important to you in the next few seconds, and then we can show those results here in a moment. Okay, thank you so much for your participation. We have a question from someone on social media. How much is currently being invested in alternative policing efforts, such as community policing crisis response teams? Is council considering increasing that funding?
Sure. So one of the initiatives from the past year was the Safe Charlotte initiative that City Council unanimously approved last year. On that was a couple of alternatives that were mentioned. One is it doubled the number of community policing crisis response teams. So what those are is a police officer partnered with a counselor or clinician to try to de-escalate a situation before it turns into something more dangerous, and to assist in mental health issues. And that was about $750,000 that was put into that to doubling the number of teams. Beyond that, there was also $1.2 million that was put into the budget this year for the city's first civilian response model, which is modeled, these are relatively new nationally, but there are a few out there, modeling after that, where you assess the risk of a 911 call, and if it's very low risk and we feel like the situation could be helped without a police officer, we would actually send an EMT and a clinician or a counselor to try to assess that issue. They've been successful programs in other places, so we're still trying to get that off the ground. That one's a little bit more complicated because it wasn't something that we had been doing yet. So we're still trying to get that one off the ground. We will be able to get it off the ground soon. So we do have the investments and the pilots of those programs. I think it's very safe to say that if there's success and we get good results and good data, that this city council would clearly be interested in expanding those based on the prioritization that they gave it in the Safe Charlotte initiative. Beyond that, and this goes outside of budget a little bit more, but if you're able to listen to our wonderful police chief on Charlotte Talks the other day, he did talk about within policing some of the ways that they're trying to get out in the community for community engagement and things of that nature. So I think we are continuing to invest in those alternatives, and I think we're also a big initiative of the current police chief is working on some of that with police officers as well.
Thank you. As a gentle reminder, you're welcome to raise your hand if you're in the WebEx or put your name in the Q&A if you'd like to speak. We, of course, want to hear from you. We're also super grateful for all the comments and questions we've received on some of our social media platforms, and that's where this question comes from next. Are the impacts from COVID-19 forcing the city to cut funding in some areas? If so, where are those areas?
So we were able to weather the storm for the most part through COVID because of a couple of different things. The first is our property tax base is relatively stable. So for the most part, our taxes were paid. So even with some of the impacts with COVID last year, our primary revenue source remains stable. And then beyond that, in some of the areas where we did not have that revenue stability, we did have the advantage of getting a significant amount of stimulus funds to help us weather the storm in some way. Beyond that, we were also able to get through some of the more difficult times of the pandemic. Just because we're such a big organization with 8,000 employees, we were able to use some things such as hiring freezes and things of that nature to get us through financially. I'd say that some of the services become more difficult. If we would not have had a pandemic, it's probably safe to say we would have been able to invest some more into our capital program, some other initiatives that City Council had been planning on. We're hopeful that we see a full recovery and we can get back to some of that. I don't know if there's anything else. I'll turn it over to Brent here.
Yeah, hi, Brent Cagle, Assistant City Manager. I guess what I would say is the simplest answer is no, I don't believe that COVID has caused us to cut funding. Certainly there were some departments, especially on the enterprise fund side of the house. So again, those departments that are not tax supported but are user fee supported, like the airport, the aviation department, and CATS, they saw significant declines in revenues because they saw significant declines in users, in passengers in the airport's case and in CAT's case. But again, that wasn't really about cutting funding or reducing funding. It was their revenues were reduced and therefore they had to make adjusted cost estimates. The other thing I'll say is we did see in some instances where service schedules were reduced. Solid waste is one of those areas. And again, that was an impact of COVID, less an impact of the funding results or revenue results from COVID, and more an impact of staffing issues that COVID created, absences and vacancies due to COVID, and also safety for crews. Some of our field units, it was very difficult for them to be able to work and maintain social distancing, so we had to look at how we provided those services in a different way to keep our employees and the community safe as we attempted to provide those services.
Thank you. Question from one of our social media platforms. Will any of the budget be used to improve the operation of existing public transit like Gold Line?
So, and this one gets a little complicated. CATS, which runs our transit system, is its own enterprise fund where it has to make decisions based on the funding it gets from the sales tax and then the federal funds that it has. So it tries to balance that. I will tell you that sales tax is recovering fairly well. And, you know, CATS is trying to maintain services through some unprecedented staffing times. And I don't mean from a CATS standpoint, I mean from a national and North Carolina standpoint. But specifically to the Gold Line, and this is where it gets complicated. The Gold Line is actually funded by the city, not by CATS as a whole. CATS operates it, but the city does fund it. We finished last year on the opening of the Gold Line Phase 2. I think they're still working out some of the issues, just like any new system that's coming online. So, you know, we're hopeful that over the next year, as some staffing issues are resolved nationally, things stabilize, that service can, become as reliable as light rail service. As far as investments beyond that, it's the discretion of City Council if they wanted to put additional city dollars towards an enterprise fund like CAT, just like they did with Gold Line. So that would be a topic that would potentially come up at a budget workshop.
Great, thank you. Are there budget plans to increase public safety outside of the budget for police? For example, additional programs for high crime areas?
So last year we had in police a focus on 4 specific areas that had a disproportionate amount of crime. And so this is more of a operational question for police. So I'm not going to go too far down this road. I can tell you that the police chief and some of the things that they're asking for in this upcoming budget, they are looking at ways, of course, to address increased crime and violent crime where they may occur. It's just 1 year, but it does seem to show that this 2021 was a little bit better as far as crime than 2020, and we're certainly hopeful that trend can continue. But I think we can take that one as more of a question that we can get back on when we get a little bit more information from police.
Sounds good. Is the City of Charlotte able to decrease the funds from our automobile infrastructure and reallocate those funds to public transportation, sidewalk coverage, and active transportation infrastructure such as greenways and bike lanes?
All right, thank you for that question. That's complicated. I'll make an attempt to try to give you an answer. If you look at the capital program that's proposed that Ryan Bergman presented earlier in this presentation, while there is a substantial amount of that capital program that is allocated to transportation funding, you will notice that there is funding dedicated for bicycle infrastructure as well as sidewalk infrastructure. And in the 22 bond, both of those programs are increasing by 2 and 3 times as much as we've previously funded. So in addition to our typical transportation infrastructure improvements for streets, which provide increased capacity for cars, we are always building complete streets projects that include facilities both for pedestrians and cyclists. So I would say in everything that we do, we are always looking at that multimodal approach and working very closely with our transit department to support and elevate areas of priority for their services as well.
And one other thing I would add is when we get into the subject of greenways, one thing that we should mention is that in this area, Mecklenburg County is actually responsible for the park system. so they're heavily involved with the Greenways program as well.
Thank you so much. Saying weather the storm as though it's over is a little optimistic. Given COVID numbers are continuing to rise, does the city have financial plans for future management of COVID as the crisis continues?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that we do financially to make sure that we're stable, that we're planning ahead, and that we're able to weather some of the storms. So I think I'll turn it over to our CFO here to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. This is Teresa Smith, CFO. I think, a couple of things that we can think about. We have already mentioned some of the stimulus funds that we have, and particularly the ARPA funds. Those do extend for a longer period of time, and we're being very thoughtful about how to use those funds to maintain us through this COVID crisis. We are also, as we talk about our bond program and we look at issuing debt and adding debt to the city, we do take very conservative estimates when we're looking at that, so that we are planning ahead for what may happen and that we don't take on too much debt. I would also mention that we do maintain reserves, so we have those exactly for situations like this. So there are several things that we do as far as planning to make sure that we are in a good place to be able to continue to weather storms like this.
Thank you. I know that's very comforting. How is the city planning financially for the Great Resignation? Will it consider increasing salaries or benefits across the board to remain competitive in the job market?
Yeah, that is a great question. Clearly, the Great Resignation is something that we're concerned about. I would say when we start to look at employment trends and vacancy levels, not only are we concerned about the Great Resignation, I would say the other thing that COVID has taught us is for a lot of the city's employees, probably 75% or so, remote work is not an option. They're staff who cannot work remotely. Their job won't allow for that. And in those kinds of positions, we're on top of the Great Resignation, we are seeing higher than normal vacancy rates, and it is becoming very, very difficult for us to compete in the market. There's a shortage of supply, if you will, from an employee standpoint, for skilled trades and those kinds of things, on top of the Great Resignation. So we are concerned about that. We are looking at that. In the past, the city has taken efforts to look at public safety pay plans. We're coming to the end of a 3 to 4 year period where we were focusing on those things, and now we, on top of continuing to look at public safety pay plans, we are committed to and concerned about the pay for our hourly employees as well as our salaried, but especially in the labor and trades groups.
Great, thank you so much. Has the city considered a vacant commercial lot tax? We're losing a lot of potential tax revenue from low-value surface parking lots that should be redeveloped.
I will go ahead and admit that I don't have a whole lot of information about this one. An interesting idea. I will tell you that a lot of times there are things that are able to be done in other states that are not able to be done in North Carolina, because in North Carolina it's what's called a Dillon Rule state, where all of our power has to derive from the state. So there's certain things that we're unable to do. I'm not sure if this is one of them, but that's a really interesting idea, and we'll get back to you on that one.
Great, thank you so much for that question. Does council consider setting aside funding for things like Major League Baseball or similar potential investments during this budget process?
I'll start, and I'll let Teresa jump in here. The way that we handle it is we have dedicated hospitality funds that generate that generate meals tax and hotel tax each budget year. And so then at any given point, there may be capacity within those funds where it has to go towards something like professional sports or amateur sports or certain art things and things of that nature. But typically, if there's a big deal such as Major League Soccer a couple years ago, it usually happens outside of the budget process. Through city council and actions and everything like that, but it doesn't necessarily coincide with the budget process. Is there anything I missed there, Teresa?
No, I think Ryan covered that pretty well, but I will just echo again that these would be projects that are generally not funded out of the general property tax because we do have those separate revenues that support them, such as the hotel tax or the meals tax. And so what we would do as these projects are presented, we would take a look at them individually based on those separate sources of revenue and how those revenues can be spent to see if we can afford those projects. So we do an affordability analysis anytime a project like that comes along.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question regarding our Vision Zero program. Since Charlotte recently became the 10th deadliest metro for pedestrians, how do you plan to use the budget for our Vision Zero program to reduce pedestrian fatalities?
Again, this is Liz Babson with CDOT. Similar to the answers that I provided earlier, with increased funding in our future capital bond for 2022, we anticipate an ability to continue to do projects that make our streets safer. So it's not just that Vision Zero funding, which we'll use to improve and increase street lighting on our streets throughout the city, but it's also continued infrastructure investment to make a connected network for our cyclists and our pedestrians throughout the city.
And just a quick follow-up, is there a place where I can find more information about Vision Zero and what exactly it covers?
Absolutely. We have a Vision Zero action plan that's available on the website. I don't know that website location by memory, but we can get that for you.
Great, thank you so much. We're closing in towards the end of the time that we have, but we have a few more questions, so if you want to try to get those questions in, we have one right here. Please feel free to do so. Is the city going to create its own parks department? Part of the delays with the greenways is because the city doesn't own responsibility for the greenways inside its city limits.
Sure. So that's a very, very big policy question that would be best answered for City Council. I can tell you that staff hasn't been directed to work on that, so it's not something we're working on in any way, shape, or form, but we'll certainly include your preference for that as feedback that we'll give to City Council.
Great, thank you. Can you explain the process for affordable housing? How is it funded specifically, and how long does it take to get units built?
This is Sean Heath. I can start on that. Picking up on where Budget Director Bergman left off related to the Housing Trust Fund. So, historically, we will have one or two RFPs for the Housing Trust Fund per year. And coincidentally, we are in the midst of an RFP right now associated with remaining Housing Trust Fund dollars from the 2020 bond. So as Budget Director Bergman mentioned before, there's an entire life cycle associated with the development work in order to position the projects for potential local funding for Housing Trust Fund, state level tax credits. So typically for our pipeline at any point, we will see it's a portfolio of projects that are being pushed through the Housing Trust Fund, ultimately through a state credit process, getting all the financing package. So there is quite a bit of lead time associated with getting these projects all the way from the design phase into construction and ultimately having the units online. I don't know, Ryan, if there's any additional granularity you could provide on specifics around timing.
Yeah, I think the timing really depends on the development itself. I think they're all going to be a little bit different, just like any construction project. As Sean mentioned, we do have the application periods, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would have to be all done in a certain time frame.
Does the city plan to follow the county by including a racial equity line item in the budget outside of the mayor's racial equity plan?
Yeah, so I think beyond some of the things that, for example, you just mentioned, like the mayor's racial equity challenge, some of the programs around our corridors of opportunity program, the city values diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an equity steering committee consisting of several department heads and city staff. The steering committee is making recommendations throughout the city. One of those would be on an adopted city equity mission statement. And then what I'd say is beyond the work of the equity steering committee, we are also looking at how we include diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of our processes, things like our hiring processes, things like our workforce development and training processes, creating equitable opportunities across the organization for career advancement and training, all of those kinds of things. So hopefully that provided you with an answer to, the city's commitment to equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so certainly we are as a city committed to that, and will continue with that commitment.
And I'd add two things. Last year with our budget, we introduced equity-specific performance measures for each department, for each service, trying to ingrain that into every city service that we've been doing for a long time. And then beyond that, and somebody's going to have to help me because I am forgetting the third E, but what's the other E? Equity engagement, what's the third? Environment, okay, sorry. The mayor did just create a new committee for city council members that I think their first meeting was this past month, and the committee's charge is around environment, equity, and engagement. So I think that there's going to be some city council focus on this, which will lead to staff directives, which may be similar to what you mentioned. Oh, and I would also mention that Federico Rios is heading up that for the city.
Are there any updates on the Safe Charlotte since the one-year update provided at the council meeting in September?
So I think in the next couple of months, you will see the next round of funding for some of the nonprofits in the community that are trying to reduce violence. Last year, we gave out $1 million. That money for this year is in the budget. So I think a process will come through again this year on that. As I mentioned earlier, they're getting closer and closer to getting off the ground with the civilian response model. And I think those are the two key things that we'll look at. Some of the other recommendations we continue to work on around retention and youth programs and things of that nature, but those are probably the two biggest updates, which are only a few months away here.
What are we doing to prioritize safety for pedestrians and cyclists versus car infrastructure? Are traffic calming and protected infrastructure being required in all road resurfacing and developments?
Yes, so I would say we have transportation policies that have served us well and been in place for more than the last decade. So we can easily apply those requirements to prioritize pedestrian safety, build bicycle infrastructure, and provide all of the things that build out that connected transportation network to make those users safer. We do that through our capital investment. We are also, as a city, going through a process right now in updating our land development regulations, which you may have heard of, and that's our UDO. Council is considering updated zoning requirements and development requirements, so that as private development builds out that transportation infrastructure, they can continue to build onto those safety policies that we have adopted in our transportation system.
Great, thank you. On the topic of environment and sustainability, can you speak to funding projected for FY23 and specific areas or departments for which those dollars may be allocated?
Sure. Well, we can't go too far into 23 before we talk to council. But if our starting point is 22 and building off of that, I can talk about some of the investments that we've made in sustainability. We've been purchasing electric sedans for the last 3 years. And beyond that, we continue to build charging stations to handle additional city vehicles, because the two things need to go together. We're up to 85 charging stations for electric vehicles that we now have in the city. We are in the process of completing a major investment on a Green Source Advantage program, which is a solar farm in Iredell County that the city essentially financed, and in return we get electric bill credits from Duke, and the energy produced from that farm, which I believe will go online late next year, is enough to offset 25% of the carbon produced in our buildings. So that's good. We continue to invest in rooftop solar for our buildings. We have over 1 megawatt of solar energy from rooftops that is in design at this point. And then let me turn it over to Brent to talk a little bit about the enterprise funds electrification, specifically around buses.
Yeah, so there is a strong commitment from both the CATS department and the aviation department. You may already be aware, but the aviation department is now, they have completed 2 years of purchases to electrify their bus fleet. They initially thought that it would take them 5 to 7 years to fully electrify fleet. Again, we'll be rolling into the third year in FY23. CATS just recently announced a pilot program. I believe that it's 18 buses they are procuring. Electric buses, fully electric buses. It is, I believe it's 6 buses from 3 different manufacturers. The purpose of that is really a test run, a pilot program, so that they can evaluate the 3 primary manufacturers of electric buses in North America that meet their purchasing requirements. That then will lead them to a full-on effort to fully electrify their bus fleet over a series of years. But they are in the initial phases of that, which was the initial purchase of those 18 buses.
Okay, great. How is the city looking at demand for remote work and to attract remote employees from large corporations versus over historical tax incentives to require in-person employees?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to some of our thinking around Great Resignation, also around how we can be competitive in attracting and retaining employees. One thing that COVID has taught us is that it is possible to remote work for a lot of our employees. You know, as I said before, about 75% of our employees are field staff and they can't remote work, but that still leaves a full quarter of our employees who have that option. As we start to, as we have adjusted for COVID, not start to, but as we have adjusted for COVID and continue to do our work, we will continue to allow for hybrid work schedules. What we find is, of that 25% of employees who can remote work, we feel comfortable and the employees see the benefit of a hybrid schedule, which would really look like 2 to 3 days per week remote working with with the remaining balance of 2 or 3 days in the office for team meetings, for things that require in-person office time. We think that that's a great benefit to those employees. We don't see any productivity losses in that. In fact, we see some productivity gains. So we are committed to that. We've actually already changed city policy around remote working and hybrid schedules to accommodate that, and that will not, we do not anticipate that going away as we start to, whenever it is, come out of the pandemic.
And then adding to that, to your second part of the question, how does that impact business recruiting? We'll get an answer to that from our economic development department on how their strategy is shifting based on remote work.
Okay, we got a couple comments about how to stay connected and engaged. We'll make sure that on that webpage, you'll have the information to do the budget simulation tool where you can walk through the work that the budget office does to create and prioritize the budget. You can also complete our community input survey where you can rank priorities and provide your input on specifics about the budget. And then you can also continue to join our listening sessions. You can speak at the public hearing, and you can also send us an email at strategyandbudget@charlottenc.gov if you'd like to stay connected with us. I think we have one last question that just came through. Can you explain why CMPD seems to have a bigger slice of the pie, and what can we do if we would like to see their funding reduced?
So I'll provide a little bit of context around that. CMPD is our biggest service. One of the reasons for that is because they are a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week service. So what that means is they still only work 40 hours a week, or a little bit more if there's overtime. But if you want one employee in one spot at all times, like say one employee in one part of the city on patrol, you essentially need 5 employees to work that in a given week. And so when you get to that, I think 86% of police funding is personnel. So it's their salary, it's their benefits, and it's their insurance. And so really what the investment is, police is investing in a number of officers to be working in the city at a given time. So we have 13 patrol divisions, I should say, and each of those, an average population is about 70,000 people. So when you think about it from those terms, we have about 13 different areas to be policed or patrolled, and each of them, on average, is a top 10 to 15 city in North Carolina. And so each of those divisions will have a little bit over 100 employees, 100 police officers on patrol. And so really just to have an adequate amount of employees at a given time, you are paying a lot of money in salary and benefits for the police officers themselves. To answer your second question, we are, City Council sends the directives and the policy for any type of change, and so we're responsive to that. And so Tiffany talked about some of the tools for engagement, and really that's the answer to how any of this would change or other things would be explored.
Great. Thank you all so much. I want to thank our panel for being here today and for providing such outstanding responses to your questions. And then most importantly, I want to thank everyone who tuned in through social media or through the WebEx and attended. We look forward to continuing to engage with you throughout this entire fiscal year budget process. And we thank you so much for your time and participation. Have a great day.